Looks like it's starting up. Okay. I think we are live. Alright, great. So today we are continuing with our module on blackmail, and today we're reading Feinberg, who we've heard a little bit about already. Katz gave a sort of overview of his a different version of his theory than the one he's going to present here. The one he's presenting here is specifically focused on resolving the first paradox of blackmail. So recall from yesterday that the first paradox of blackmail is that blackmail involves two acts which individually, on their own, are perfectly legal to engage in, but when combined into one act become illegal, and in particular become blackmail. So, to remind you of the canonical case that we've been discussing before, Deborah finds out that Jack is cheating on his wife, and Deborah goes to Jack and says, pay me $10,000 or else I'll reveal to your wife that you've been cheating on her. Right? So that would be Deborah blackmailing Jack there. And that's a sort of standard case that we can think about. The first paradox of blackmail, again, is that it would be perfectly permissible, legally speaking, for Deborah to tell Jack's wife that he's cheating on her, for her to ask for $10,000 from Jack, not accompanied with a threat, and for her to threaten Jack that she's going to tell his wife about him cheating on her, so long as there's no request for anything in return. It's just a threat. So that's the first paradox of blackmail, and that's what Feinberg is trying to resolve in this article. Alright? So, first notice that the harm principle is at play again here. We spent a couple weeks already talking about the harm principle, and here it comes again. Feinberg wants to find a way that we can make blackmail illegal and using only the harm principle as our guide. And the harm principle, remember, says that, Feinberg's version of it anyway says that it's always a good reason for there to be a limitation on liberty in order to prevent wrongful harm to others, right? Harm that violates other people's rights. There's always a good reason for that. So, if we're only utilizing that principle as our way of thinking about what the legitimate restrictions on liberty are, then it's difficult to find a place for blackmail, especially given this paradox of blackmail. So, what Feinberg wants to do is find a way to fit it in. Now, there's an alternative principle, which he mentions, which he calls the exploitation principle, and his version of this is that it's always a good reason in support of penal legislation, that is, a limitation on liberty, that it will prevent wrongful, that is, unjust gain for one person, even when there's no corresponding wrongful loss, there's no corresponding harm, right? You can see how this is different than the harm principle because it doesn't require that anyone be harmed. It only requires that someone wrongfully gain something, right? Now, it's pretty clear that the exploitation principle could be used to justify a prohibition on blackmail. However, Feinberg sets us up with a trilemma that is like a dilemma but with three different options. So he says that we either have to find a resolution within the harm principle to the paradox of blackmail, or we have to admit that blackmail should be legal, or we have to accept the exploitation principle And for Feinberg, that means giving up on liberalism. And liberalism for Feinberg, he doesn't mean in the context of American politics, liberal versus conservative. He means in a broader philosophical sense of liberalism, which says that the government should be limited in the sort of ways that it infringes on our liberties pretty strictly, like to restrain the government very significantly in putting limitations on our liberty. Right? That's the idea of liberalism, the basic idea. And for Feinberg, that comes to only having principles like the harm principle allowed to justify limitations on liberty. Right? So if we were to adopt the exploitation principle according to Feinberg, we would be leaving liberalism. We would have to no longer consider ourselves liberals in this broader sense. Okay, so Feinberg goes on to analyze blackmail into 5 different categories, and he admits that these categories aren't perfectly bright line, clear distinction. There can be cases that are sort of in between and vague, and it might be difficult to categorize, but they're broad categories that give us an idea of the different considerations that we might have in particular cases of potential blackmail. So the first category are threats to expose criminal wrongdoing. So you can think of a case where one person I know that you committed a crime, and I come to you and I threaten, I will report your crime to the police unless you give me $10,000. We'll just keep using that example. Right? And what Feinberg wants to say about this is that we as citizens have a duty to cooperate with law enforcement and to our fellow citizens to help criminals be properly judged and put into prison or fined or whatever the relevant penalty might be. And so he thinks there's no paradox here, that the paradox of blackmail doesn't even hold in this case, because in this case he says it's not perfectly within our rights, within our legal rights, to withhold that information from the police. So we're offering to do something which we have no right to do, or we don't have a perfect right to do in any case, he says. Note that this is explicitly against what Bloch says in his article, and also I believe he's cited here in Feinberg. So Bloch thinks that it's not legitimate for there to be any law which requires you to report criminal activities of other people or to cooperate with law enforcement in that way. Feinberg thinks that there is. So this is a sort of disagreement on another level and on a different issue that's coming into play here. And part of what explains their disagreement in these particular cases. Okay. The second category of blackmail that Feinberg sets up is a threat to reveal that the victim has engaged in and continues to engage in perfectly legal but devious trickery or underhanded dealing. So this is a case where so there are lots of different kind of cases which might fall into this category. You might think of reporting on a merchant who engages in sort of shady business practices, but not ones which are strictly illegal. You could think of someone who has an undeservedly good reputation, even though we have lots of evidence to suggest that they don't deserve that reputation. They've been doing lots of things contrary to it, right? And Feinberg suggests that we may have some sort of moral duty to expose such people and to go out and tell the public about their undeserved reputation or their underhanded dealings, but that we don't have a legal duty. and that there's good reason for us not to have a legal duty to do this. So he thinks that in these kind of cases, we actually ought to permit this kind of blackmail. If I were to come to you and say, I'm going to expose your shady business practices unless you pay me $10,000, Feinberg thinks that the law should allow for that sort of thing to go on. It might be a little scummy of me to be willing to withhold that information from the public. Maybe I have some sort of moral duty to expose you in that sort of case, but not a legal duty, and so the law perhaps should stay out of this, according to Feinberg. So this is going to be the one category that he thinks that we should legalize blackmail. The third category are threats to expose some innocent characteristic or activity that's not objectively discreditable, but would in fact damage the victim's reputation in some groups if it were disclosed to them. So there are lots of cases we could think of here. Maybe someone has mental illness, which if it was made public, some people who are prejudiced against people with mental illnesses would treat them worse. Someone has lots of sort of circumstances where this could come up. And Feinberg wants to say here that privacy rights are what make it the case that this sort of threat that I might make to you to expose something that would be embarrassing to you, or that a group of people might find discreditable even though it's not in fact. My threat to do this to you is in fact threatening to do something I'm not permitted to do, because I'm threatening to violate your privacy rights, your right to privacy. And therefore this is a kind of extortion and not blackmail, and so it can rightly be prohibited, according to Feinberg. It does in fact wrongfully harm you if I do that. Violates your right to privacy. The fourth category is threats to expose past mistakes of a currently reformed person. And Feinberg says that this is a tough case. It would be paradoxical under our current way of understanding our obligations as far as dealing with other people's reputation. But Feinberg thinks that we ought to make it the case that these malicious disclosures, which serve no significant public interest, right? I'm disclosing, perhaps your past criminal history, but you're now reformed, or your past drug use, but you're now reformed, to people who would hold it against you, and that your reputation would suffer with them, even though you're reformed. So it doesn't really serve a significant public interest, but it does damage you significantly. It doesn't serve a public interest in particular because although some people would take these facts as relevant, they aren't in fact, because you are in fact reformed. And I know this, right? I'm doing this maliciously. I'm doing it just to harm your reputation. In that sort of case, Feinberg thinks we should reform the laws on defamation to include these malicious disclosures, even though they're truthful, right? So a defense against defamation is that what you're saying is true, but Feinberg thinks we should make an exception to that in the case where it's true, but it serves no significant public interest, and I'm doing it just to damage your reputation, right? So if it was legally prohibited, as Feinberg thinks that it should be, then this category of things likewise would not be paradoxical anymore. It would be me threatening to do something which I have no right to do, and therefore it's a sort of extortion again, and not blackmail, right? Or blackmail of a kind, which is not paradoxical in this way. The fifth and final category is threat in any of the other categories to make accusations that you know to be false, right? And Feinberg says that there's no paradox here whatsoever. You never have a right to make false statements which are going to harm someone's reputation, get them in trouble with the law. That would be a case of perjury, something like this. All of those cases, in each of the other categories, you can see that it would either fall under something like defamation or perjury or some other prohibition that already exists in the law. And so there would be no paradox. I would be threatening to do something that I have no right to do. Right? No paradox there. Right, so that's Feinberg's general view on blackmail and how we might resolve the first paradox of blackmail, at least, and show that in many cases it ought to be prohibited without moving beyond the harm principle, without moving to something like an exploitation principle. And so, there is one category, category 2, remember, which he thinks actually perhaps we should just legalize in order to resolve the trilemma in that category. But for the other 4, he thinks that there's a good way to resolve the paradox, and therefore we can hold on to liberalism, we can hold on to restricting ourselves to the harm principle, while at the same time prohibiting blackmail, right? So that's it for Feinberg. Let's see. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them now. I'll just wait a couple minutes, or a minute or two. See if there are any from the chat. Okay, it looks like there aren't any for today, so I will see you tomorrow for the final lecture in this module, and then later tomorrow night for a review session. So I hope to see you there, and thanks.